American Morning, the most news in the morning, period. Weekdays 6 Eastern.
Well, the main fact is that prohibition, the policy we pursued, hasn't prevented kids from getting access to heroin, including very, very cheap heroin. All the tens of billions of dollars we spend every year to try to raise heroin prices and other drug prices, in fact, have been unsuccessful. Heroin prices have fallen dramatically, and as your story pointed out, is now incredibly cheap. And at the same time, we're getting all the ancillary costs of drug prohibition, such as the violence in Mexico that spills over in the United States. So we're not accomplishing the goal of keeping people away from heroin, and we're having enormous costs in addition. So I don't claim that legalization is a solution. Some people will misuse drugs, even if it's legal, just as some people misuse alcohol. But the magnitude of negative things would be vastly reduced if it were legal.
Bob, we talk about some stats from the Office of National Drug Control Policy. They estimate that we spend more than $500 billion a year on substance abuse. We're spending all this money and we don't seem to be making a significant dent in anything. So what would be the solution if legalization isn't?
Well, the present system certainly is broken and needs to be fixing. But what the professor is advocating is that we, instead of using dynamite to raise a building in a construction site, we A-bomb the city. Look, drugs are bad. Drugs are not illegal. Drugs are not bad because they're illegal. Drugs are illegal because they are bad. They cause death, they cause overdose, they cause dependence. Anyone who has an alcoholic in their family knows that alcoholic affects entire parts of the family. If we want to take that Natalie story and multiply it by 5 times, that's what we will end up with if we legalize drugs. We need to make a lot of changes, but the one change we don't need to make is give any drug to any person at any age who wants it for any reason. The United States cannot afford to end up with best estimates, about 50 million drug addicts and alcoholics running around this country, with us supporting them.
All right, well, part of the commentary that Jeff wrote is from our CNN.com site is prohibition creates violence because it drives the drug market underground. This means that buyers and sellers cannot resolve their disputes with lawsuits, arbitration, or advertising, so they resort to violence instead. And, you know, it's an argument that we've been hearing a lot about when it comes to violence on the Mexican border. But do you believe, Jeff, that putting aside, you know, the human toll in terms of addiction, that legalization would stop the drug violence that we've been dealing with right now in Mexico and in our border towns?
Yes, I do. I think the evidence is very clear. The best example is alcohol prohibition. We saw lots of violence in the alcohol trade in the 14 years when it was prohibited in the U.S. in the 20s and early 30s, and that violence stopped almost immediately as soon as it was legalized. As Mr. Stutman says, we're not going to eliminate all negatives of drugs by legalizing, but he's exaggerating enormously to say that we would have this huge increase. There's not a shred of evidence to suggest anything like that.
Hold on, one quick sec. This is a shred of evidence. The DEA says that they tried legalization in Alaska. This experiment in the 1970s led to the state's teens using marijuana at more than twice the rate of other youth nationally. So when they tried to say, let's make pot illegal, the kids were using it twice as much.
They didn't legalize, they decriminalized. That's one episode. We've had 13 or 14 states in the U.S. We have many countries that have substantially lowered their penalties, and there is absolutely no correlation between use rates and whether these drugs are prohibited and how hard we try to enforce the prohibition. So the evidence just doesn't support these claims that there would be a dramatic increase in use.
All right, and Bob, I want to let you weigh in on this. You say that addicts should get treatment, that treatment should be the emphasis, not criminalization, meaning not locking them up. How do you make that work?
Kiran, first 2 things. Professor Mayer may go to Harvard, but he's dead wrong on this issue. Virtually every study and every person I've debated for the past 20 years says you legalize, you will at least double. Some studies say 5 to 10 times as much. You give drugs to kids, they'll use them. Period. Anybody that thinks that's not true has never met a kid or a drug addict. Secondly, we clearly have too much emphasis on criminalization in this country. I don't believe we should be throwing drug addicts in prison. I think we ought to have a drug court system where we mandate treatment for those who need it. I think we need to have treatment available for anybody who wants it. And maybe most importantly of all, as your lead MP said, we've lost a whole generation by not educating them about the effects of drugs. We need to educate kids so they never start. It is a heck of a lot easier to stop a kid from using drugs than to ever get them off drugs once they start.